Hello and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and in this video I will be doing a bookshelf tour. Yes, finally I have decided it is time to go through with this, I don't know, Booktube rite of passage, I guess. I have several shelving units in my room. This is obviously the main one, the one you see when I do, a reading wrap-up, a book review, etc, etc. I have five main shelving units, so I will be first presenting the shelving unit, kind of going through the way I organize the books within said shelving unit, and then, zooming in on the books. I won't be taking each book individually out. I might take a couple of them out to showcase them, especially if I've never talked about them before on my channel. Otherwise, I'll just be, scanning the spines, reading the titles out loud, and, make it up as I go along, basically. I will, though, be taking books out to show you, back rows of books in the case where I double shelve my books, because despite me having a lot of bookshelves, even that's not enough to showcase all of my books directly, because last time I tallied them up, I think I have between 400 and 500 books total. So in those cases, obviously I'll be removing the front rows and showing you the back rows. Well, I'm obviously going to start this off with the shelving unit you can all see behind me in the vast majority of my Booktube videos. This is basically my main fiction shelving unit. The top left-hand corner and the top right-hand corner basically contain all my standalone novels, whether SFF or not, as well as not quite series, but basically novels which are in the same universe, such as City of Saints and Madmen and Shriek, and Afterward by Jeff Vandermeer, but aren't technically sequels of one another. Okay, I just lied because I do have The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments by Margaret Atwood. That's basically the exception. That confirms the rule. I do also have a few memoirs mixed in there, but for the most part it is fiction. Directly downwards and opposite with the lower left and right hand corners, those are all basically my SFF series, so duologies and above. Now if we take the middle column, above and below, I have an assortment of graphic novels, or, what we call in French, des bandes dessinées, but standalones, and also items of graphic nonfiction. And then if you take the middle row, to the left is my Song of Ice and Fire shelf/cube, and to the right is my Ursula K. Le Guin shelf/cube. A little note on the way I organize my books, generally speaking. In this specific instance, it's mostly by alphabetical order, but you'll see later on in the video that for non-fiction shelves, I tend to organize by theme or specific subject. So yeah, my shelving system, well, isn't weird to me. To me, it makes perfect sense, obviously, but I suppose it would appear slightly weird to others. But so yeah, it's kind of a hybrid organizational system. Right, so zooming in on the fiction with, like I said, a few memoirs interspersed here and there. So like I said, we have The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments by Margaret Atwood, which is the exception that confirms the rule of keeping my SFF series below. Then we have Monsieur and Alice by Emma Becker. I vaguely talked about Emma Becker in a French language book review for La Maison, which was also written by her, which I didn't like at all, but I loved those first two novels by her. Followed by You by Joanna Briscoe. We have The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories by Angela Carter. The Book of the Unnamed Midwife by Meg Allison. Herland and the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which I haven't talked about before, I don't think. Herland is an example of older classic, I suppose, feminist SFF. It hasn't aged that well, but it is interesting within the context of feminist SFF literature. Then we have Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which is my favorite classic dystopian and my third favorite dystopian overall. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is beautiful but heartbreaking. Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Casey. Lady Chatterley's Lover by J.H. Lawrence, which I've kept despite the massive book unhaul I had a couple of months ago. I mean, I reread it a 18 months ago, so now did not like it when I had really enjoyed it 15 years ago. But it has a special place in my reading history, I guess, so that's why I kept it. And of course, my 2 collected volumes of H.P. Lovecraft fiction, which will this year be completed by the 3rd around, well no, in October. Then we have Solaris by Stanislav Lem, very strange, but quite good. Kraken and Embassy Town by China Mieville, Atonement by Ian McEwan, which is another beautiful but heart-shattering novel. My Dear Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, followed with Ada or Ada by the same author. Then 3 publications by Anis Nin, my favourite erotica author, so we have Delta of Venus, Little Birds, and Henry and June. 1984, of course, by George Orwell. Women on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy, which is another one I haven't talked about on my channel. It was a great example of feminist utopian and dystopian science fiction, basically. I would really recommend that one. Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. Of course, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, which I've talked way too much about on my channel. And Le Consentement by Vanessa Springora. And so behind that first row is the alphabetical continuation of my standalone novels and memoirs, because we have Darkness Visible by William Styron, which is a memoir, brilliant memoir about depression, which I would highly recommend. Like I mentioned previously, City of Saints and Madmen, and Shriek and Afterward by Jeff Vandermeer, Born and The Strange Bird by the same author. I mean, like I said, those 2 are in the same universe, those 2 are in the same universe, but they aren't technically sequels of one another, which is why they aren't shelved with my SFF series. Then we have The Colour Purple by Alice Walker, another beautiful but heart-shattering book. Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurtzel, Putney by Sofka Zanaviev, which was definitely heart-shattering to me, and then an anthology, Sisters of the Revolution, a feminist speculative fiction anthology edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, and it was pretty good overall. And finally, Useless Magic by Florence Welch. I am quite a big appreciator of Florence and the Machine. I really enjoy her music, her voice. She seems like an interesting person as well. And so this basically collects all her song lyrics as well as original poetry. Now moving on to the SFF series shelves. Here I'm not entirely following my alphabetical organizational scheme because reasons, I guess. Just I don't know. It's the way they've been organized for a while and it's the way they're going to remain, whatever. So first we have Le Bal des Louves, volume 1 et 2 by Mireille Calmel. I read a few of that author's fiction back in the day. So she's a French author who principally writes fantastical, fantasy-light historical fiction. I kept these 2 because I remember enjoying them quite thoroughly back in the day, once again, though I should probably reread them at some point. To put it very simply, it features female werewolves. I mean, it's a curse, and it takes place in, what, the 16th century? Or the 15th? In France. And I enjoyed the historical fiction aspect, I enjoyed the characters and the character relationships. Beyond that, though, it really needs a reread. Then we have The Age of Fire Hexalogy by E.E. Knight, which I've mentioned a couple of times before on my channel, I believe. It's really neat because the main characters are basically dragons, and not anthropomorphized dragons, actual legit beast-like dragons. And they're a lot of fun, and the world building is actually pretty decent. And yeah, I would really recommend it if you're a dragon nerd, basically. Then we have the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood, which is oh so depressing. Very good, mind you, but do not read this if you're anxious and depressed about, I don't know, climate change, the excesses of technology, basically anything that science fiction warns us about, because in those books, it gets cranked up to an extra level. And continuing with that idea, we have the Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents duology, I mean the Earthsea duology by Octavia E. Butler, which is my second favorite dystopian after The Handmaid's Tale. And so in front of that back row, and you might have noticed that from the Madame trilogy onwards, it is in alphabetical order. So we have the Duneverse Chronicles by Frank Herbert, obviously in the beautiful, though slightly weirdly formatted paperback editions. There's the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and yes, I will be continuing with the Realm of the Eldening series. And then we have the Children of Time and Children of Ruin duology by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is brilliant. Followed on by the extraordinary Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer and the awesome Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams.
Coming back up, we're going to move on to the graphic section. So, this is an assortment of both graphic fiction and graphic non-fiction in both French and in English. First, we have Speak the Graphic Novel by Laurie Halse Anderson and Emily Carroll, which I've talked about in a dual book review. There is this little art book called Joli Monstre by the artist Aube. So, this is one of those art books that you could basically buy through the artist directly. This dates back to my DeviantArt days. You'll never find this in a bookstore, but it was really neat. It basically features female mythological creatures and monsters, and it's very pretty and it's very lovely. Then we have Queer: A Graphic History by Meg John Barker and Julia Scheel. It's a primer on queer theory from both an academic and an activist standpoint. It also traces the history of that current of thought, I guess you would call it. Now, quick note, I actually disagree with a lot of what queer theory has to say, especially where it intersects with feminist theory. However, this is a very good reference on the subject, and as such, I found it very interesting. Following on with Anaïs Nin sur la mer des mensonges by Léonie Bischoff, which is now my favorite graphic novel of all time, and for which I have done a separate French language review. Une histoire du sexe by Philippe Breno et Laetitia Corinne. This is a book of graphic non-fiction about the history of sex, basically. Human sexuality, especially in the West, mind you. I had some issues with it, especially with the very first chapters, but otherwise it was quite good and quite interesting. Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Bosch, which I've talked about before. La Différence Invisible by Mademoiselle Caroline Julie Daché, which is a graphic memoir about Asperger's syndrome from, more specifically, a female point of view. Really enjoyed that one, talked about it in a monthly reading wrap-up. Did have a couple of issues with it, but overall, I found it very interesting, very thought-provoking. It spoke to me, etc., etc. Through the Woods, again by Emily Carroll. This is an anthology of short horror stories that I would definitely recommend as well. And then we have Draconis by l'artiste Shane. The artist Shane, sorry, I slipped into French there for a second. This is another one of those self-published art books by an artist from my DeviantArt days. Super Crash by Daryl Cunningham, which is a book about the 2008 financial crisis. Very interesting. It also talks about Ayn Rand and basically what led to the financial crisis, the politics behind it, etc., etc. Would highly recommend. Two little books called Le Vrai Sexe de la Vraie Vie, Volume 1 et 2 by the artist C. Basically translates to The Real Sex of Real Lives. It's quite cute. It's a bunch of vignettes about people's sex lives and the silliest side of sex, the accidents that can happen, but, also the bonds it can foster, and yeah, it was nice. Then Artemisia by Nathalie Ferlu et Tamia Baudouin. This is a biographical graphic novel about Artemisia Gentileschi, a female Renaissance painter who in the past, 20, 30, 40 years has been reinstated as one of the great painters of the Renaissance. Marbles, Mania Depression, Michelangelo and Me, a memoir basically about, manic depression, bipolar type 1, by Alan Forney. Dirty Biology, La Grande Aventure du Sexe by Léo École-Grasset. I have talked about this. Did I do a separate review for it? I think I did. In French, this is an absolutely brilliant non-fiction graphic, well, not novel, but you know what I mean, about sexual reproduction, the myriad forms it takes within life and its different kingdoms, and it's very, very funny. I would definitely highly recommend it if you speak French. Journal d'une bipolaire, which is a graphic memoir about bipolar type 2. Morgane, which I've also talked about on this channel before. This is a beautiful graphic novel about Morgana and re-exploring the Arthurian mythos. This is, once again, an art book I got through Kickstarter about, female protagonists in literature, as you might have guessed from the title, Ladies of Literature. A Compendium of Witches by Natasa Ilinchik, for which I've also done a separate review. This is a magnificent art book about witches from different ages, different places, and different, alignments. You've got druids, priestesses, alchemists, etc. It's magnificent. If you can get your hands on it, I would definitely recommend you do so. And finally, Goupilou Face by Lulubi, which is a graphic memoir about cyclothemia. And then downstairs, we have La Fille dans l'écran, for which I also did a book review. A lovely, warm little lesbian love story that felt like a mug of hot chocolate, basically. Two books about the history of cyclothemia psychiatry in France, or I mean psychiatric hospitals more specifically, HP, tome 1, L'Asile d'Aligné, and tome 2, Crazy 70s. We have Libre and Baiser après Me Too, both by Ovidi and Degli, which touch upon feminism, gender, rape culture, post-hashtag Me Too, and things like that. We have Histoires inavouables, again by the same author, and that's basically erotica. Le Grand Méchant Renard, which was a gift from my ex. It's a very cute story about a fox trying to, eat, hunt, farm animals, and failing miserably because he's just not very good at it and he's not very scary. It's basically a reference to The Big Bad Wolf, which in French is Le Grand Méchant Loup, so here's The Big Bad Fox. Pour la Peau, which is another erotic graphic novel. And we have Heart and Brain, Gut Instincts by The Awkward Yeti. Yeah, I mean, I can't remember what the name of the comic artist is, but maybe some of you have seen this on the internet because I think a lot of these comics were published originally on a blog or something. And yeah, as you can see, it features organs from the human body and it's very funny. I really like this. Becoming Unbecoming by Yuna, which I've talked about in said dual review, in which also features Speak the graphic novel. Chicken Thoughts, comics about birds, which is ridiculously adorable, and I would again highly recommend you at least go check out this artist's Instagram page or Facebook page if you love birds, even if you love animals. And then we have A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo. So if you're familiar with Last Week Tonight and or John Oliver, you'll know what this is about. For those of you who aren't, it's the story of a gay little bunny who wants to marry his boyfriend. And I mean, it's got to do with US politics, but otherwise it's just a very cute little story, and the proceeds from this book went to a good cause, and that's why my parents and I got it, basically. And that's my little griffin head, which I made myself. So yes, my Song of Ice and Fire bookshelf with all the currently published novels in the main series. Behind we have the Compendium of Maps, which are very beautiful, very detailed, and you would only get this if you were a Song of Ice and Fire nerd, basically. The World, or is it A World of Ice and Fire? No, I think it's The World of Ice and Fire, which was written mostly by fans, but vetted by George R.R. Martin. I'm not sure if I got that right, but again, Song of Ice and Fire nerd, had to have that. Then this is basically, once again, an art book that was funded through Kickstarter. It's called Draw Them with the Pointy End, which is quite amusing. So it's a bunch of illustrations around Song of Ice and Fire. These are all the published graphic novels for Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. I sincerely hope they continue on with this series because it's basically the only, hopefully somewhat accurate adaptation we'll get of the novels in, visual/graphic format. Then Fire and Blood Volume 1 and the Duncan X Stories, so A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. And my main Ursula K. Le Guin shelf. We have Worlds of Exile Illusion. This is an omnibus containing 3 separate stories. There's Rockinon's World, and then I can't remember exactly, something like City of Illusions, World of Exile, something like that. The word for world is Forest, which is one of my favorites by Ursula K. Le Guin. The Eye of the Heron, The Dispossessed, one of her big classics, alongside The Left Hand of Darkness. We have The Lathe of Heaven, Always Coming Home, The Wind's 12 Quarters, and The Compass Rose, both in the Science Fiction Masterworks editions. And Tales from Earthsea and the Other Wind. My other Earthsea books are on another shelf because they're much smaller format, and I mean, ideally I prefer series to stay together, but some of my shelves are lower or narrower, so that's why they're not put together. Then we have Gifts, Voices and Powers, the 3 books of the Annals of the Western Shore trilogy, and Lavinia. So these 4 are basically young adult fiction, and Lavinia is kind of an Aeneid retelling. The main character, she marries Aeneas, I think, is called Lavinia, as you might have guessed. So it's fantastical, historical, mythological fiction, if you will. And then finally, my collection of Tolkien books. You might think they're a bit snubbed by being put at the back of the shelf there. I mean, ideally, sure, I'd love them to feature more prominently on one of my bookshelves. But as it stands, it's the best way I could make it work with all of my other books. So, sue me, I guess. And as you can see, they're all illustrated editions. So we have The Silmarillion, Beren and Luthien, The Children of Hurin, The Hobbit, The Fellowship of the Ring, and The Two Towers. Yes, I would like might have The Return of the King, but I couldn't find it in the Alan Lee illustrated paperback edition, or I mean, not for a reasonable price in any case, and so I read it through one of my dad's old copies. I also used to have Unfinished Tales, so I have read it, and I will acquire it again in the near future because they've re-edited it in an illustrated edition, but so far it's only out in hardback. I'm waiting for the paperback release, which should be later this year, hopefully, or beginning of next year, maybe. And of course, I've yet to read The Fall of Gondolin, but I mean, that's on my TBR shelf, so it will join the rest of these soon enough. So yeah, that's my main fiction shelving unit. It's pretty stable for the moment. I mean, I still have space in the upper left and right hand corners for more, fictional standalones and or, a few memoirs if I feel so inclined. I also still have space below for SFF series, and that's where my Baslack / New Crobuzon trilogy books will go once I finish them. That's where my copies of the Poppy War trilogy will go once I finish them. I mean, unless I hate them and then hold them immediately, but I doubt that will be the case. I mean, I hope it won't be the case. I still have space as well for graphic novels. Now, when it comes to my Song of Ice and Fire and Ursula K. Le Guin shelves, those are pretty much permanent / stable for the foreseeable future. Like I said, I'm going to add a couple of things to my Tolkien collection at the back there. So yeah, some things might still get shuffled around in the future, especially with the upper fiction shelves and with the lower SFF series shelves. Moving on to my second shelving unit, it has 3 shelves, as you can see. On the topmost shelf are large format non-fiction books and reference books. The second shelf is dedicated to all of my beautiful special editions. And on the lowermost shelf are large format graphic novels / as we call them in French, bande dessinée. Zooming in at the bottom first, so like I said, a group of large format, basically graphic novels. In this case, they are not at all arranged in alphabetical order. They are arranged by genre, loosely speaking. First off, we have the 2 tomes of La Déesse by Katia Even and Nephila. They are erotica, basically, with a smidgen of mythological fantasy thrown in. There's Lecture Frivole and Esmera. Those 2 are also erotic graphic novels. Les gens de la table ronde. This is an omnibus of 3 graphic novel stories around the subject of the Round Table and the Arthurian mythos. We have 50 nuances de grec, which basically recounts episodes from Greek mythology, but with a significantly humorous twist. And yeah, it was very funny and highly enjoyable. Love le renard and Love les dinosaures. Those 2 are beautiful, what I'm going to call silent graphic novels. There's no dialogue at all. They're more art books than anything else, but I mean, they have a narrative to them, right? And so this first one follows a day in the life of a fox on a volcanic island, if I remember correctly. And the second one follows, I think, a dromaeosaur, actually, in prehistory, surrounded by lots of other dinosaurs. And I think the artists are Italian, and they've also done an album like this with a tiger or a lion, or maybe both, and I would definitely highly recommend them. We have Pour de Mille Bêtes by Stéphane Fer. So he's the one who also illustrated Morgane, and I have talked about this on my channel beforehand. This is also a beautiful retelling of a piece of, I'm pretty sure, French folklore. Bluebell's Wood, which features carnivorous mermaids and has a bit of Lovecraftian inspiration thrown in. Merlin. This is one of my favorite art books of all time. This is a retelling of the story of Merlin, and once again, the Arthurian mythos, the Arthurian legend, with a lot of pagan influences thrown in. I adore the Mists of Avalon, so this was right up my alley, and the art style is magnificent. And so one of the artists who worked on this also did Shaman, Les Chants de la Déesse, which I've also talked about in a monthly reading wrap-up, and this is an art book about female shamans from around the world. Then we have 2 books on dragons called L'Univers des Dragons, tome 1 et 2. They're art art books about dragons with little stories and different artists contributing. This is also a book about dragons, but it pretends that dragons are real, and so it features, you know, illustrations of dragon anatomy and things like that. It's called Le Dragon Petit Traité de Sciences Naturelles, so a little natural history treatise on dragons, basically. Fées et Déesses is an art book about fairies and goddesses, mostly of Celtic origins. The Atlas of Middle-earth, so if you're a Tolkien nerd, you'll know what this is. It's the map book. The Dragon Lover's Guide to Pern, which is a companion book to the Chronicles of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. It's basically a world-building book. I mean, a book that provides additional world-building information, biology on the dragons, information on the societal structure of Pern, etc., etc. I adored this when I read it at the age of, 12 or 13. We have Arthur Spiderwick's Field Guide to the Fantastical World Around You. And so this is also an art book featuring lots of illustrations of mythological creatures, fantastical beasts, from within the universe of the Spiderwick Chronicles by Holly Black, I think. And I read this again like 10 years ago. The World of Might and Magic, the Asher Compendium. One of my all-time nostalgic favorite video games is Heroes of Might and Magic 3 specifically. It's a fantasy strategy turn-based computer video game. And, you know, they made further ones with more contemporary graphics. This art book basically takes a look at the creatures and the factions of the 6th game, which, I mean, it'll never be as good as Heroes of Might and Magic 3, but I really love this art book. Les Femmes qui aiment sont dangereuses is a book which features different paintings around the subject of women in love or loving women. This author/editor also did this with like women reading and female artists, I believe. I would like to check those books out one day. And then Ars Erotica is a big non-fiction book about erotic art and literature. Then up above, we of course have my pride and joy, my special editions bookshelf, featuring two little, well, not custom made, but handmade bookends. So yeah, my copies of The Handmaid's Tale, Dune, The Books of Earthsea, The Left Hand of Darkness, A Game of Thrones, Lolita, Northern Lights, and The Silmarillion. And then up top, like I said, an assortment of non-fiction, well, I mean large format non-fiction books and reference books. Over here, a few reference books on animals, birds, parrots, a bunch of thick books on mythology, folklore, etc., with tomes that, you know, focus on magical creatures, monsters, dragons, and things like that. Then that kind of transforms into books related somewhat to ancient civilizations, paganism, etc. Like, you know, this is a book about the Wheel of the Year. This is more like an archaeological treatise on the peoples of Europe that predated the Indo-Europeans, a book on druids, a couple of books about sacred sexuality, or I mean the mix between sexuality and spirituality and things like that. My big The Feminism book. Then the two beautiful, informative art books by Rachel Ignatowski, Women in Science and Women in Art, and then a bunch of books on art, the history of art currents, things like that. They're all from the publishing house Taschen. If you don't know about them, they're like the reference for anything art and art history related. Another reason for that is because their books are very good. A lot of them are actually not that expensive for what you get, and they're always high quality, so I would highly recommend that publisher if you're into art and art history. So I have books on Romanticism, the Pre-Raphaelites, I love the Pre-Raphaelites, Symbolism, Gustav Klimt, Alphonse Mucha, because I just adore Art Nouveau, and then a bunch of books about drawing techniques and things like that. And so, as you can see, there's still quite a bit of space on my lowermost shelf. What I might do at some point is shove in quite a few of the graphic novels I showed from my first shelving unit so as to free up space on that one for SFF literature, basically, so standalones and series. Maybe I'll then be able to feature more prominently my Tolkien books. I don't know, it's an idea I'm playing around with in my head, but realistically, though, it won't happen anytime soon. And so basically on the opposite side of my room, you have the third shelving unit, which houses my, well, not special editions, but my special little collections. Penguin Library editions, Fantasy Masterwork editions, and Science Fiction Masterworks editions. And then on the third shelf, we have all my Avalon series books and the rest of my Ursula K. Le Guin's. And at the very bottom is an assortment of odds and ends. We've got some graphic non-fiction anthologies stories and books about poetry, poetry anthologies and rhyming dictionaries, but I'll get to that in a second. Starting with the Penguin Library editions, we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft, The Grey God Pan and Other Stories by Arthur C. Machen, The Murders in the Rue Morgue and Other Tales by Edgar Allan Poe, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and Dracula by Bram Stoker. Then on to the fantasy masterworks with Mythago, Wood and Lavandis by Robert Holstock, The Forgotten Beasts of Veld and Umbrian Shadow by Patricia A. McKillip, and The Falling Woman by Pat Murphy. And then it's on to the science fiction masterworks with Rodder with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, Babel 17 by Samuel R. Delany, Ammonite by Nicola Griffith, Native Tongue by Suzette Hayden Elgin, Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. I've never reviewed this on my channel, but please read this. It's a beautiful and heart-shattering science fiction novel. And on the second shelf, Ringworld by Larry Niven and Incredible Fire by Rachel Pollack, The Female Man by Joanna Russ, The Gate to Women's Country, Grass and Raising the Stones by Sherry S. Tepper, Her Smoke Was Up Forever and Other Stories by James Tiptree Jr., Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion, Brilliant by Dan Simmons, Roadside Picnic and The Snail on the Slope by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon, and The War of the Worlds, of course, by H.G. Wells. And so on the third shelf, we have all my Avalon series books. Ravens of Avalon, The Forests of Avalon, which was previously titled The Forest House, I believe, Lady of Avalon, The Magnificent, The Mists of Avalon, and Priestess of Avalon. And then the rest of my Ursula K. Le Guin books. As I mentioned earlier, my Earthsea books are not all together. This is where the first four reside, so A Wizard of Earthsea, The Tombs of Atuan, The Farthest Shore, and Tehanu. Then we have my beloved The Left Hand of Darkness, The Telling, The Birthday of the World, and Other Stories, which is my favorite short story collection by Ursula K. Le Guin, A Fisherman of the Inland Sea, Four Ways to Forgiveness, and Changing Planes, which is the last thing I read by her. And on the bottom, like I said, is a weird little assortment. We have all the books I have in the La Petite Bibliothèque de Savoir collection. I did a video talking specifically about this collection of graphic non-fiction, if you're curious. I really love this collection, but it doesn't seem like they're going to publish any other items in it, which is a damn shame. So the ones I have is L'Univers, le tatouage, Histoire de la prostitution, le féminisme, le conflit israélo-palestinien, les zombies, les abeilles, le libéralisme, naissance de la Bible, crédulité et rumeur, Homo sapiens et l'anarchie. So the universe, tattooing, history of prostitution, feminism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, zombies, bees, liberalism, the birth of the Bible, credibility and rumors, Homo sapiens, and anarchism. Then we have two chunky anthologies that have to do with erotic literature. One is about erotic, well, not short stories, but what do you call them? Well, fairy tales is not the right word, but that's how it would translate to English, so, and fables is not the right word either. I don't know, des contes. They're little stories that are usually pretty whimsical, even fantastical, but they're erotic as well. And the second anthology comprises short stories, novellas, even short-length novels from, well, the history of French erotic literature, really. And then books about poetry. We have Penguin's poems For Love, which is an anthology of love poetry, William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, Les Fleurs du Mal by Charles Baudelaire, The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur, and then two rhyming dictionaries, one in French and one in English, of course, for my two native languages, and two books which, to be quite honest, I haven't really much used. So as you can see, my two special collection shelves are pretty much full, and yet there's still several books in those different collections I plan on reading and, well, as such, acquiring. So this particular shelving unit will be reshuffled fairly soon, and my Avalonian and Ursula K. Le Guin books might be moved to another shelving unit, so yeah. Otherwise, though, the bottommost shelf will definitely, most probably at least, stay there. At the very least, the two topmost shelves will remain dedicated to these different collections, but in all likelihood the third one will also become dedicated to these collections as well in the near future. And finally, moving on to the two last shelving units-ish, or at least the last shelving units and the couple of hanging, floating shelves I have. I'm not sure what you call them. So these two shelves basically house all my regular format non-fiction books. And the shelving unit below supports my printer for one thing, my loom at the moment. And then I have, again, a mix of things. Series from my childhood, a bunch of non-fiction books, and some graphic fiction as well. So when it comes to my non-fiction shelves, and really this applies generally to all of them, I organize by theme or by subject matter, basically, and not by alphabetical order. Starting with the topmost one, we have a bunch of books that kind of touch on mental health, mental illness, things like that. You got a book about psychoanalysis, book about borderline personality disorder, book about sexual violence and PTSD. Then it kind of moves on to books about animals more generally, and more specifically about animal behavior, animal cognition, animal emotionality, with various different titles. Then we've got a few books about science. I mean, one about physics, and two about the intersection between science and more spiritual metaphysical things, with an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson called Nature, which is a beautiful, brilliant essay I would highly recommend. Then we have all my books about psychedelics and more specifically psychedelic medicine, which I've talked about in a dedicated video if you're interested. And that moves into books which are directly about spirituality and, alternative religions and systems of belief, such as neo-Druidry, neo-shamanism, neo-paganism, though here it's mostly neo-Druidry and neo-shamanism, including a book which isn't actually about spirituality, but is a historical analysis of the neo-pagan movement as it was born or birthed in the UK in late 19th century up into the 1950s. It was written by a history professor, Ronald Hutton. It's called The Triumph of the Moon. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's a fascinating book. It's very interesting. I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in the history of religions, honestly. And so at the very end there, we have a bunch of books which are about, fictional universes. There's a book about Narnia, a book about Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire. There's a book about Avatar, the movie by James Cameron. And then the deluxe essential Pokemon handbook, because nostalgia. Because I freaking adored Pokemon as a kid, because fantastical creatures, there's a running theme here. So when I saw this, I was like, what the hell? Why not? Just for kicks. So yeah, I have a Pokemon reference guide. And on the second shelf, we have a lot of books about birds, which I've also done a dedicated video for, if you're interested. And a bunch of books about feminism. This is basically my collection of feminist books. This is where they go if they're of that general format, with titles such as When God Was a Woman, The Chalice and the Blade, Sorcière, which I've talked about in a monthly reading wrap-up. That was an excellent book. Books which are generally about neurosexism, the concept of gender and deconstructing it, so Delusions of Gender and Testosterone Rex by Cordelia Fine. To me, those are must-reads for feminist theory. If you have to read anything concerning feminism, gender, sexism, and deconstructing those things, then read those books. They are brilliant. In the same vein, we have The Gendered Brain by Gina Rippon, Everyday Sexism by Laura Bates, Les Coups sur la Table by Victoire Tualion, which was a book looking at masculinity, which was very interesting, Invisible Women by Caroline Prado Perez, which was also a brilliant book looking at the lack of sex-specific data in lots of different fields. Then we have a few classic feminist essays, including A Rumour of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, Extracts from the Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, and The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf. Then we've got this book, En finir avec la culture du viol by Noémie Renard, which is the best book I've ever read about rape culture. If you have to read one thing in French about the subject, read that. And then those books slowly give way to books about sexuality more generally, or more specifically about female sexuality or non-monogamy and things like that. We've got this book, which is about the history of the pedophilia movement in the 1970s. I didn't really know where to put it, so I kind of just shoved it there. And then, a book about bisexuality, a book of essays, a couple of books about ethical non-monogamy, and various titles to do with human sexuality, with also additional books on erotic art and literature more specifically. And then finishing up with the University Challenge quiz book, because why not? And once again, I didn't know where to put it, so that's where it went. And so moving on to the very last set of shelves. So, like I said, this is where I also keep the series I read in my childhood, early teenagehood. We have The Inheritance Cycle here by Christopher Paolini. Is That Materials trilogy, of course, by Philip Pullman. Now, notice that right next door are the first two books in the Book of Dust trilogy. I mean, ideally they should be sticking together, but it just didn't quite work that way, did it? So, yeah, I mean, I reason it in my head that one is technically children's literature and the other is more for adults, and so it goes with other more adult books. Whatever. It works in my head. We're not going to discuss this further. So, technically, behind these, I have all of my Harry Potter books. I'm not gonna take out the front row. You know what those books are. And so, on this shelf are a bunch of, well, my Pen Chronicles books and various novels, which are SFF or not. As you can see in the front, we have the first two books in the Book of Dust trilogy, Small Gods by Sir Terry Pratchett, My Little Handmaid Boo bookend, all my Pen Chronicles books, like I said, and a bunch of novels in French. Oh, yeah, and Alice's Adventure in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. So in French, we have The Delta Venus. I have a copy in French because it was a gift from one of my exes, so it has a bit of sentimental value, and that's why I've kept it. We have La Jouissance et l'Extase by Françoise Rey, which is a reinterpretation of Henry and June, basically. So, I mean, yeah, I said French language novels and a small bunch of erotic novels as well. We've got Venus in Furs by Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, which I kept because it's a classic of the genre, and that's why I read it. I mean, it's not my thing at all, but I found it interesting. It goes back to my interest in human sexuality and its presence in art and literature throughout the ages. Then we have La Nuit des Temps et L'Enchanteur by René Barjavel, which are two novels which have a special place in my heart and reading history. They are science fiction and fantasy in French, which, well, I don't want to be mean. I don't know if it's rare or not, but it's rare for me to find something in French in those genres which I like. And those two are kind of rare exceptions to that rule. Again, an odd little assortment, I suppose, but that's just the way it worked out when I rearranged my shelves. And then my next to last non-fiction shelf, so double shelved once again and organized, like I said, by theme, subject matter. In the back, I mean, I'm not gonna, once again, take out the front row. I don't think it's necessary. You basically have a bunch of reference books, a couple of little art books about birds, insects, flowers, plants, mushrooms, just reference guides for the natural world because it's something I really enjoy. I love identifying things. And we have a bunch of like short graphic introductions to various subjects. I have the one for psychoanalysis, psychology, economics, romanticism, and feminism. And so in the front row, it goes back again to one of the great loves of my life, which is mythology, folklore, fantastical things in general. The first two, The Language of the Soul and The Language of Love, are weird little mishmash books that take art, images around the subject of the soul, spirituality, or love, and sex, I guess, and then has little texts to go with those illustrations and reference mythological things. And then a bunch of books about mythology, like I said, world mythology, then Egyptian mythology, Celtic mythology. This collection of books has a name, I can't remember what it is, but you've got one for tarot, astrology, and all those things. But then you also have tomes for mythology, mythical creatures, and one on Wicca. So it kind of goes back with my general collection of books about neo-paganism. These are bunch of little books published in Wiltshire, and I say it like that because Wiltshire is the region where the British side of my family comes from, back generations I might add, and so these are all little books published in Wiltshire about, well, some of the features you find in Wiltshire, such as Stonehenge, Avebury, and then little things to do with nature, spirituality, neo-paganism, and things like that. And finally, the wit and wisdom of Tyrion Lannister, because he's awesome. And on the bottom, my very last non-fiction bookshelf, which again continues this insane trend I apparently have of collecting books on mythology, folklore, esoterica as well, and occult things, and yeah, it was just a significant special interest of mine for a large part of my life. I mean, it still is today, but I've calmed down a bit on that front, let's put it that way. So again, just a reference on mythology, a book about Norse mythology more specifically. Then we have a copy of the Mabinogion published by Oxford University University Press. From Ritual to Romance, that's also kind of a reference text, more specifically on the Arthurian mythos and its mythological roots. A book about goddess worship, a book about the goddess Inanna, Lilith, a book about Merlin, which I actually used for a school project back in high school. Again, a book about sacred sexuality, or in a couple of them. Have a book on alchemy, a Taschen book. So remember I mentioned this publishing house. This is basically an art book about these old alchemical illustrations you had in like the high Middle Ages. Insane, crazy illustrations layered with symbolism and meaning. Of course, if you know nothing about alchemy, it's meaningless and just appears strange and weird, but actually has meaning. So it's a bunch of those illustrations. It's a very cool book. A book about Freemasonry. I just wanted to know about that subject, so I read a bunch of books. That's the only one I kept on the subject. A book about tarot to have a reference on the subject, and then a couple of books about Eloise Abelard, which was a mythicized romantic couple from the Middle Ages, basically. I got into that very niche little subject for a short while because reasons, and yeah, it kind of breaks the general theme of this shelf, I'll admit. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have what I'll call my English language graphic novel series shelf, with a couple of anthologies at the beginning there. Otherwise, I have all the currently published tomes in the Monstrous series, all the currently published tomes in the Saga series, all the published tomes of Sex Criminals and of Why the Last Man, and I still have a little bit of space for missing tomes and perhaps something else though. Yeah, I'll probably have to use another shelf if I want to acquire additional series, really. And those two little pamphlet-looking things at the end there, they're basically small art books. And finishing up the tour, we have, well, my TBR shelf. And I won't go into what's on it right now. I mean, apart from the titles you can obviously see, because, well, I want that to remain a bit of a surprise. And also I'll probably do a book haul video at some point in the near future. And right up above is basically where I put the books I finished during a month. So this month, well, I've read more than that, but some books came from the library and obviously I took them back. But so here are the books I owned, which I read this month. I stacked them up there, then do my monthly reading wrap up, and then I put them away on their respective shelves. So yeah, those were my last shelving units. As you can see, the one on the bottom there still has a lot of space in it. It's actually the most recent shelving unit I've acquired. I needed more space for all my books, and now I have more than enough, but don't worry, it'll get filled up soon enough, I'm pretty sure. If you would like more information on a book that was shown in this video, which you cannot find otherwise on my channel because there isn't a pre-existing book review for it, or I haven't mentioned it in the monthly reading wrap-up, I'd be more than happy to provide said information. In the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer as usual. I hope you're all doing reasonably well and taking good care of yourselves, and I shall see you fairly soon in the next video. Bye-bye!